Hello! The subject of today's video was suggested to me by one of my viewers. So today we're going to be looking into mirrors. Mirrors are a great thing to engrave on. You can usually pick them up very cheaply online or sometimes even get them for nothing. And once they're engraved, they can make something very pretty and practical to use around the house. So today we'll look a bit more into engraving on mirrors and how to do it. And let's start by thinking about the anatomy of a mirror. A mirror is made up of 3 layers. Top layer is a clear layer. Often, mostly, it's glass, but you can get acrylic mirrors as well. And if you were engraving something for a child's room or something like that, you might want to consider getting an acrylic one. But this is glass, and most of the ones you'll be engraving on glass is the top layer. The middle layer of a mirror is so tiny thin you would never be able to see it no matter how closely you looked at it, but that is the silvering layer, the reflective layer that the image appears in when you look into the mirror. And on the back of a mirror, of all mirrors, there is then a protective layer painted or sprayed onto the back because the silvering is so delicate that the slightest scratch will mar it. So there's always a protective layer. In older mirrors it's often quite very thin, flaky, powdery coating. In modern mirrors it can be almost quite rubberized, but it's just there to protect the silvering. Now what that means is you have 2 options when you're engraving your mirrors. You can either engrave on the front side, or you can flip it over and engrave through the protective layer and through the silvering, and doing all that from the back. What I will do today is show you an example of both of those methods, and then you'll be able to decide hopefully which one is right for your project. In order to do that, what I've done is I've drawn out a little rosebud, and then I've printed that out on the computer a couple of times just in case I make a mistake or something. For the version I'm going to be engraving from the front, the rosebud is this way round, and for the version from the back I've flipped that round this way, because if you're going to be engraving from the back of something you always have to have the image flipped over by 180 degrees. So let's mark this out onto the glass, and then we'll go into the workbench, engrave that, and I'll let you see how it looks when it's done. To transfer the picture onto the front of the glass, I'm using one of my preferred methods, which is to tape the picture onto the glass and slip a little piece of carbon paper in behind it. Then all I have to do is go over all the lines and they will transfer onto the glass. It's quite a faint image, but it works quite well. With the front done, I have to move on to the back of the glass, using exactly the same method here with the picture and the carbon paper, but this time the rose has been reversed so that it will look to be pointing in the same direction when we're looking at it from the front. And with the pictures transferred over onto the glass, I can go into the workshop and start engraving as usual. As I normally do, I'm going over the lines a little bit with a little white Arkansas stone, just because the carbon paper lines will tend to come off during the engraving process, and I don't want to lose sight of where I'm supposed to be engraving. With the lines transferred, I can start cutting into the glass a bit more with a diamond burr. I can't use my usual setup here with the water dripper because this glass is quite thin and it needs to be supported all the way across the back. So I was using a little spray bottle there to keep the glass wet while I'm using the diamond burr. And with all the diamond point engraving, I can go over the edges with a little rat's tail burr just to make them nice and sharp and smooth. And then I can go over the areas that need to be shaded. This is a little black polishing rubber. Polishing over the engraving makes it a little bit darker, shades it down. And then just finishing off with another polishing rubber. With the front done, it's time to move on to the back. Now the back is a little bit different because it does have this protective layer on it. So instead of the white Arkansas stone to draw the outline, I'm using, it's a brown aluminium oxide stone here. But it's the same process, just marking the lines onto the glass so that I don't lose sight of them when I'm doing the engraving. And I'm using another brown aluminium oxide stone to remove the backing, and then beginning the engraving properly with the diamond ball burr, just as I did for the glass at the front. There's a lot of powder comes off from the backing as well as from the glass, so it's best to work in a well ventilated area and of course always wear a mask. Again, I'm still working with a diamond burr here, cutting into the glass from the back and going over some of those areas with a polishing rubber, a black one, to get the shading into it. Now there's just the top part of the rose to do, so it's back to a diamond burr, marking out the shapes of the petals. Right, let's have a look at how the engraving has turned out. First of all, the version engraved from the front. You can see it's quite light, quite bright. You can see all the detail of the engraving quite clearly. Now, if I can contrast that with one done from the back, that gives a much darker engraving. All of the detail still shows up quite well, but overall it's darker. Now obviously I've put something dark behind here. If you are going to engrave from the back of your mirror, remember you're going to have to paint or put a backing inside the frame to make it show up. It doesn't, I suppose, need to be black. Maybe you could get a nice yellow rose, I don't know. But you're going to have some sort of backing inside the frame to make the engraving show up. So those are the main differences between the engraving from the front and engraving from the back. The engraving from the front is generally much lighter looking. Now, when I started this, what I had planned to show you at this point was the downside there can be of engraving from the front of a mirror. And that is a very strange double vision effect you can get. Your engraving is done on the front of the glass, and that engraving is then reflected in the mirror layer which is behind it. And you do get a very strange fuzzy double vision effect. The problem I'm having is that this mirror is incredibly thin, and what I'm finding is, although you can see that sort of double vision effect, it's not showing up very clearly. So what I've done is I've taken another piece of mirror which is more of a normal thickness. This mirror is 1.8 millimeters thick. This one is 3.8, so it's more than twice as thick. I've taken the same rosebud, put it onto this one, and hopefully with this one you can see more clearly this double vision effect. Now it may be that you're not worried about that effect of the engraving reflecting into the mirrored surface behind, that you're perfectly happy with that, and in that case engraving on the front of the mirror will work very well for you. It gives a very light image. If you're intending to add a lot of text to your mirror, you may find that that double vision effect can be a little bit off-putting. In that circumstance, you might find that it's easier to engrave from the back. Or, as we discovered earlier on, if you want to engrave on the front of a mirror and you don't want to see much of that reflection in the mirror itself, you can always go for a really thin mirror. It made a big difference on this one. I thought it might be useful for you to see how this might work in practice. So I've got this old mirror that I was given, and I'm going to update this one a little bit. To start by taking out the backing and removing the mirror. The original mirror was rectangular, but I want a square one, so I'm going to have to cut that down. So start by marking out the size that I want. And once I've got that marked, I just check and make sure that that's square. Obviously this square is not long enough to go all the way across the glass, but at this point I'm just scoring the backing, the protective layer at the back. Once I've done that, I can see that line looking at it from the front, and that helps show me where to cut. But I'm going to need a longer straight edge than that. And as I was getting oil to put on the cutter, I managed to spill some in the glass, and that reminded me that it's actually much easier to cut glass that's really clean. So I gave it a little bit of a clean, put oil back on the cutter, and score along the line. And then it's just a quick snap, and the mirror is cut to size. Now obviously, having cut down the mirror, I also have to cut down the frame. And this frame is put together using V-nails, which are really awkward to take out. So I've just cut down the side of them, cutting into the bit that I'm going to be making shorter anyway. And then I'm using a chisel to take out the pieces of wood in between the V-nails. Once all the little extra bits of wood have been taken out, I can then get hold of the V-nails with a pair of pliers and wiggle them out of the frame. The V-nails were just about all that was holding this frame together. There was very little glue, but a quick sand at the end to remove any glue. And now I have to cut down the sides of the frame to the right size. And check that that cut's going to fit together. Doesn't look too bad. I'm going to use this clamp to hold the frame square, and I'm going to replace those V-nails with some long panel pins at the corner. So everything looks to fit together, and a little bit of glue on both sides of the joint. Back on with this fiddly little clamp arrangement. And I have pre-drilled the corner to take the panel pin, so I'll just drive that in just now to help hold it while the glue dries. Now that the glue's dry, I've sanded the frame down, and I'm going to paint it with a sort of mid-grey chalk paint, furniture paint. And once the whole frame is painted and the paint's nice and dry, I will be putting a layer of furniture wax on that to protect it. Now I decided that I wanted to do a sort of seascape in the mirror, a gull skimming over the waves, so I had to draw that out and then, using carbon paper as before, transfer that onto the back of the mirror. To start with, I was using this green stone to take off the protective layer on the back. Later on I found a much better way to do it, so I'll show you that when we get to it. And then in with a diamond bar, starting to make sure that the edges are smooth and clean. And beginning to add a little bit of detail onto the wing where the feathers will go. It's quite important to be careful at the edges because sometimes the silvering can flake at the edges. You need to be quite careful. Again, back with the green stone, making sure I've got all of the silvering off. And now I have a little white Arkansas stone. The edges of the wing are quite dark, so I'm using the white Arkansas stone to pre-polish that area, and then coming back in with a rubber polishing bit to get some of the shadow in where I need it to be. That process continues over the whole of the bird. Oh, putting his little eye in there. This is a softer grey rubber polisher, just reintroducing some of the shadows into the bird. And again getting the very darkest bits done. So there's just the tail really left to do there. Finished that in the same way, and then moved on to doing the wave. Now I've taken off quite a lot of the silvering here. In fact, I've basically cleared most of it. I have left one or two little flecks of silvering in the water so that I'm hoping it's going to look like little sparkles in the wave. And I'm going over it with polishing rubbers and the white aluminium oxide stones to try and get the light and dark areas of the wave. I said I'd found a better way to take the protective layer off the back, and actually that grey polishing rubber makes a super job of it. It takes it all off very, very easily and gives quite a nice clean edge to it. So continue adding highlights. Again, that's the white aluminium oxide bar. And then for the very lightest areas, I've moved on to a diamond bar, picking out just the very lightest, brightest parts of the wave. I've obviously decided I need a bit more highlighting in the wave here. And with the last of the highlights added, that's it all done. And no, I did not engrave clouds on it. It's just the only way I could get a proper photo of it was to take it out into the garden. And I have a little extra bit for those of you who have had the stamina to stick with me to this point. I said at the start you could engrave the front or the back of the mirror. But there is another option, because you can engrave both sides. Now, I would urge you to use caution if you're going to do this, because obviously if you're engraving deeply on both sides of the mirror, there's a risk that you might meet in the middle. But it is possible to go onto the front of the mirror and just pick out some highlights, as I'm doing here, just little flecks of brightness on the engraving. Now for comparison, here's the original rosebud. And then when I go and engrave the front and add the highlights, you can see how these stand out so much more. It makes the engraving pop off the mirror a little bit. So it's something to think about. It is possible to engrave both sides. I think that's all I can really tell you now about engraving on mirrors. I hope you'll go and try it out for yourselves. You can make lovely mirrors which are very practical and make good gifts. And it's worth, I think, getting used to the difference between engraving from the front and engraving from the back. However, that's the end of this video. I hope that you've found it useful. I hope that you've enjoyed it and that you'll join me again for my next video. Thank you for watching.